Welcome. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre. And while I anticipate we still have a number of people joining the room as this webinar continues, I'd like to welcome all of you to a foreign policy lecture with Peter Varghese AO, the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. Before I begin, even though we're virtual, let me acknowledge that we are situated here at the University of Western Australia on the land or the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is a lecture that I think many of you know we hope to do in person, but with the particular vicissitudes of the COVID era, we are now not able to do so virtually or in person, but still fortunate to have Peter here in Perth, just 2 offices down from me, secluded in a separate office, so we can do this without mask. It makes the video experience a little bit better. And being able to still share the lecture with you in person. I think most of you will know Peter from his tremendous career of service to our government and to our nation. Peter is currently the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, but had a nearly 40-year career of public service, including as the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian High Commissioner to India, the Australian High Commissioner to Malaysia, the Director General of the Office of National Assessments, and a senior advisor to our Prime Minister. Since his tenure in those many positions, he not only has served at the University of Queensland, but has kindly agreed to serve as a distinguished fellow here at the Perth USAsia Centre, joining former Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, our Governor, Ambassador Kim Beazley, and a member of our board of directors, former Foreign Minister and former Defense Minister Stephen Smith in that role. And we're particularly happy to have Peter join us, given his long depth of expertise, not in foreign policy more broadly, but specifically in the Indo-Pacific region. Many academics and government officials will trace the origins of the policy construct around the Indo-Pacific to Peter and his tremendous influence in government now. And we have been very fortunate to have him lead several of our Perth USAsia Centre delegations to visit India, to Delhi and Mumbai. And unfortunately, that's one thing that we were not able to do last year. And it looks like 2021 is also quite questionable. So in that context, we're very fortunate to have Peter here in Western Australia, sharing his views with us on recent developments, not just in India, but in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And then to join with our community here in a conversation. So Peter, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to your opening remarks and then to a wonderful panel discussion there afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon, for a very generous introduction. And can I say good morning to all of those who are participating virtually in this event. I'm delighted to be back in Perth, delighted to be back at the centre. And Gordon, I do want to commend the work that you and your team in the centre do to advance our understanding of the region and US engagement in the region. There's never been a more important time for the Australian community and for Australian policymakers to be focused on those issues. I want to talk today about the Australia-India relationship, really to take stock of the bilateral relationship, but also to locate it within the broader currents of the Indo-Pacific region. But I cannot but begin, however, by expressing my very deep sympathies to the people of India as they deal with this deadly second COVID wave. I mean, we've been watching in horror as the number of fatalities rise, the public health system comes under intense pressure, and our hearts go out to the victims of COVID. And obviously we should be doing all that we can to assist our friends in India. In 2018, I submitted a report to the then Prime Minister with a very simple message about India and the bilateral relationship, and that was that the transformation of the Indian economy was underway. Its progress would inevitably be uneven, but its direction was clear and irreversible. And to realize the opportunities that this opened up, we needed as a country to make a strategic investment in India, which was driven at the highest levels of the Australian government. So how does that judgment stand tested against the changes wrought by COVID and the geopolitical shifts which are now unfolding in our region? I want to make three headline points, and then I'll circle back and add some flesh to them. The first is that what we're seeing in the Indian economy is the playing out of some deep structural drivers which give it a momentum, but this built-in momentum alone will not deliver the growth rates that India needs to lift its standard of living and provide employment for its young demographic. It will also need structural economic reforms. Secondly, that if India doesn't get the economy right, it cannot play the broader geostrategic role which it and countries like Australia want it to play. And thirdly, that Australia's ambitions for the bilateral relationship are rightly high and should remain so. We want to see India as a first-tier economic and security partner with people-to-people links as close to any that we have in Asia. Now, India, I think everyone accepts, needs to be understood in its own terms. It will always march to its own tune. It's the only country with the scale to match China, but it will not be the next China. Indeed, I think comparisons with China only get in the way of understanding the singularity of the Indian economy and the nature of the opportunities in the Indian market. No Indian government, for example, will be able to direct the economy in the way China does, nor will it ever control the allocation of resources in the way China does. And both of those, I think, are intrinsic to China's economic success. China, I think it's fair to say, has a discipline to its economic planning which flows from its one-party political system and the competence of its state institutions. And for all of its diversity, China has a strong Han Chinese core which has no counterpart in the linguistic and cultural diversity of India. And I think it's also the case that India's economic model is not going to mirror the East Asian economic model. India's path will be sui generis. Its growth will be driven by consumption and services, not exports and manufacturing, and it'll be anchored in a myriad small and medium-sized enterprises. So the drivers of Indian growth are deeply structural, which to me suggests that they're also sustainable. They include the urbanization of the world's largest rural population, the gradual movement of the informal economy, which still accounts for around 80% plus of Indian employment, into the formal economy, a young demographic with a mean age of 28, considerable investment in infrastructure, the absence of which in the past has really held back Indian economic growth, and the beginnings of an ambitious program to upskill 400 million Indians. So these structural drivers will likely keep India on a relatively strong growth path. In my report, I took a relatively moderate view of the rate of growth out to 2035, assuming that it'll be in the order of 6 to 8% each year over the next 20 years. And I was assuming incremental rather than radical structural reforms. Now, COVID has probably slowed this trajectory by a few years, but it has not, in my view, stopped or reversed it. Forecasts of a strong V-shaped recovery in the first half of this year will now likely be revised downwards in the light of the second wave, which will have a significant impact also, I think, on business confidence. So while the short-term economic outlook for the Indian economy will inevitably dip, the trend line over the long term, by which I mean over the next 2 decades, will likely be reasonably close to my report's estimate of an average 6 to 8% growth per year. But while India has some strong structural drivers of growth, it's also the case that structural reforms are essential if India is to move from potential to delivery. India doesn't need any tuition on what form these reforms should take, and certainly not from outsiders. The reform agenda has been part of the Indian economic debate now for decades and includes reform of the banking system, access to land, labour market rigidities, deregulation, privatisation, and state capacity. How to do this in an argumentative and robust democracy such as India is a matter for India, but it will require a significant investment of political capital. Economic reform, we all know, is never easy, and there will always be constituencies who will oppose it. How much political capital to invest in economic reform versus other issues will be a question challenging India's political leadership for decades to come. India has shown in the past that when it must, it can deliver on economic reforms. In the last 4 decades, India's per capita income has quadrupled, and over 200 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty. The lesson of India's economic history is that the more it opens up its economy, internally and externally, the stronger its economic performance. This is the background against which India's well-wishers will view concepts such as self-reliance. Self-reliance is obviously a virtue, but the risk is that it can slide into self-sufficiency, which is a failed economic policy. Economic sovereignty has made a comeback everywhere in the post-COVID era, but COVID has not changed the laws of economic gravity. It has not obliterated comparative advantage in trade or the economic benefits from the efficient allocation of domestic resources. We should keep this firmly in mind when we discuss concepts such as self-reliance, dual circulation, decoupling, and so on. The post-COVID focus on security of supply chains opens up new opportunities for India, and India is high on virtually everyone's diversification strategy. But if India is to act on these opportunities, it will need to do all it can to increase the attractiveness of India as a place in which to invest and to manufacture. Ease of doing business is one element in this, and India has, I think, done much in this area in the last few years. But even more important are inputs such as infrastructure, regulatory certainty, a sound financial system, and access to skills. More recently, the Modi government has shown a stronger interest in economic reform. It has set out an ambitious privatisation program. It is looking to both reduce the space occupied by government in the economy and to improve the efficiency of the civil service. These are welcome signals which build on its introduction of the GST and bankruptcy reforms and its ramped up investment in infrastructure in its first term. We live now in an age of geoeconomics, and some of these trends present India with large new opportunities. China's abandonment of hide and bide, its ambition to become the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific, if not beyond, its use of economic coercion and its desire to recreate the Middle Kingdom where harmony was hierarchy with China at the top, all of this is leading other countries to balance and constrain China, and India is seen as an important element in these strategies. But India's capacity to play such a role ultimately turns on its economic weight. For India to be a balancer and a major strategic power, it needs a strong economy. Otherwise, its role will be more rhetorical than real. For India to be a geopolitical shaper, it needs economic heft. From an Australian perspective, there are 3 geopolitical factors which are drawing Australia and India closer together. First, as partners in the Indo-Pacific, we are each grappling with the implications of the declining margin of US strategic predominance and the sharpening ambition of China to become the predominant power in the region. Second, both Australia and India support a rules-based international order. That order is under increasing threat. Its defenders are shrinking and its challengers growing. But Australia can neither bully nor buy its way in the world, and a system based on rules, not power, is important to us. Third, India is a partner in seeking to forge regional institutions in the Indo-Pacific, which are inclusive, promote further economic integration, and can help at the margins at least to manage the tensions which inevitably flow as economic growth across the Indo-Pacific shifts strategic and economic relativities. That is why India, in my view, should be brought into APEC. Regional institutions are currently very much in the background, but notwithstanding the current tensions each of us face in our relationship with China, both Australia and India see China as an important part of inclusive regional institutions, especially the East Asia Summit. And both countries attach a high priority to our relations with ASEAN and the individual countries of Southeast Asia. So while India will always march to its own strategic tune and cherish its strategic autonomy, the scope for us to work together on the broader challenges of the Indo-Pacific is growing, as is India's willingness to work in the Quad together with the US, Japan, and Australia in ways which capture the growing strategic convergence of these four democracies. The Quad is not a grand anti-China military alliance in the making. It is not an Asian NATO, even if it is likely to see more military cooperation among the four countries. Indeed, India is allergic to the very idea of alliances. Rather, the Quad is a means of managing China's ambitions in a way which puts some constraints on how far it is prepared and allowed to go. It signals that leverage is a two-way street. Of course, to exercise leverage, the Quad will have to do more than meet and issue communiques in support of the peaceful resolution of disputes, the upholding of international law, and the eschewing of coercion. It'll have to be prepared to make it clear that it is willing to impose costs on China for unacceptable behavior. These costs might range from diplomatic through to economic, all the way to collective measures to uphold principles such as freedom of navigation and the law of the sea. It is this capacity to exercise leverage which will determine the success of the Quad, rather than what it does collectively in areas such as infrastructure, climate change, or pandemic responses, important as those issues are. Each member of the Quad brings a different perspective and motivation to its dealings with China. For the US, it is a means of helping blunt China's ambitions for predominance and reinforcing the absolute determination of the US to stay number one. For Japan and India, both of which carry historical baggage when it comes to China, it is a shared concern that a predominant China will narrow their strategic options and room for maneuver. The one member of the Quad for whom the core issue is the character of the Chinese system is actually Australia. Indeed, Australia is perhaps the only member of the Quad whose anxieties about China would likely disappear if China were a liberal democracy. After all, what would be the basis of our concern in those circumstances? Australia does not have any in-principle objection to the concept of a predominant power in the region. Quite the contrary, we have historically seen US strategic predominance as the bedrock of our security and also as the great enabler of economic growth in Asia. The US may speak the language of a new ideological Cold War, but the reality is it is driven more by its determination to hold on to its strategic primacy than a battle against an authoritarian system. The US would be just as determined, in my view, to remain number one if China were a liberal democracy. And neither India nor Japan, for reasons of history and geography, would be at ease with a democratic China as the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific. We may be in the same Quad bed, but we each have very different dreams. So the Quad is one means of moving from hope for the best engagement with China to engage and constrain. It is saying to China that we want a relationship of mutual benefit, but we also want China to pursue its interests in a way which respects the sovereignty of others and avoids coercion. And if China behaves otherwise, there will be collective pushback from countries which are capable of effectively doing so. Now, China portrays the Quad as containment by another name, but we shouldn't give China a veto over our strategic policy. Besides, constraining China differs from containment, whose ultimate logic is a complete rejection of engagement. Containment seeks to thwart China. Constraining seeks to manage China. Constraining China will take time to construct. It is unlikely the Quad will ever reach the NATO-like point where an attack on one is considered an attack on all. Nor is the Quad likely collectively to rush to the assistance of a member which may be the target of Chinese economic coercion. If anything, some Quad members may benefit from such coercion in that the restriction of imports from one Quad member may create export opportunities for another Quad member. In short, the Quad currently has neither the unity of approach nor the will for serious collective action. But China's behavior is rapidly filling this gap. It is also shifting perceptions beyond the Quad as more countries see with discomfort what an assertive China looks like. This has both hastened the urgency of pursuing arrangements such as the Quad and reduced the caution about offending China. China currently seems determined to behave in ways which are quickly losing its friends and respect. Polling shows this is evident across the globe, with negative sentiment about China rising substantially. Yet China seems not to care. This is either the arrogance of a nation which believes that its time has come and it can do as it pleases, or it reflects an essentially internal dynamic where the party sees domestic advantage in adopting a strongly nationalist position, irrespective of the diplomatic costs. I suppose all of us who have worked as professional diplomats have learnt that domestic considerations beat foreign policy most of the time. Indeed, what makes the management of relations with China so complicated today is that on all sides it is driven essentially by domestic compulsions. Let me now turn to the bilateral India relationship and the ways in which it is being reshaped by economics and geopolitics. At the heart of our economic agenda is a structural complementarity between the Indian and Australian economies, which is the key to translating ambition into opportunities. Put simply, a growing Indian economy will need more of the things Australia is well placed to provide, from education to resources and energy, from food to healthcare, from tourist destinations to expertise in water and environmental management. Indeed, services are likely to be the fastest growing segment of our future economic relationship with India. In virtually all of Australia's relations with India, investment lags trade by a wide margin. India holds out the prospect of being different. India has a relatively open foreign investment regime. It has the rule of law, even if delays are common. Its institutions are familiar to Australians, both derived from British models, and English is widely spoken, a very significant asset. In short, we may have a better chance with India to secure more synergy between our trade and investment relationship than we have with any other major Asian economy. My report calls for a tenfold increase in Australian investment in India, lifting India to become the third largest destination in Asia for outward Australian investment. The third pillar of the contemporary bilateral relationship, beyond economics and geopolitics, is our growing people-to-people links, which over time may prove to be the most significant asset of all. India is currently our largest source of skilled migrants, even if that program is temporarily frozen. Our second largest source of international students before COVID came along, and a substantial proportion of those who come under temporary work visas to fill skilled positions Australians cannot. In the last decade, we have seen a very large increase in the size of the diaspora, now well over 700,000 strong, and the fastest growing large diaspora in Australia. This diaspora will, in my view, have a big role to play in the partnership of the future. They can go into the nooks and crannies of a relationship where governments cannot, They can shape perceptions in a way governments are unable to. And they create personal links in business, the arts, education, and civil society, which can help anchor the relationship. This is a diaspora which is also likely to exert a growing influence on Australian politics, something which is already evident in state politics, and I think particularly here in WA. As they have in Canada, the UK, and elsewhere, the Indian diaspora may prove over the next 2 decades to be the most politically active of any migrant group in Australian history since the Irish. This will have implications for the priority of our political leaders will place on the relationship with India. The involvement of the Indian diaspora in Australian politics is reflective of a broader point. The liberal democratic character of India is a key part of its attraction to Australia as a comprehensive strategic partner. Indeed, without it, our partnership would be tepid. There have been several periods in India's history when its liberal democratic character has been tested, most notably the period of the emergency under Indira Gandhi. Today, there are again signs that the liberal democratic character of India is under pressure. I do not share the view that India has become an illiberal democracy, but they are indeed signs that minorities fear for their freedoms and key institutions tasked with independence may be too accommodating of the wishes of government. These signs should not be lightly dismissed. But when it comes to democracy in India, I tend to the view which is often ascribed to the United States, namely, there is nothing wrong with Indian democracy, which cannot be fixed by what is right with Indian democracy. True democracies, in my view, are ultimately self-correcting. So let me conclude by recalling the observation I made at the outset. India must be understood in its own terms. It holds large promise for Australia, but it cannot substitute for China economically. Nor can we assume that the challenges of doing business in India are all in the past. What has changed in India is that the balance sheet between opportunities and challenges now clearly favours opportunities. I remain a long-term optimist about India for as long as it holds to its democratic character and does not resile from the politically challenging task of further opening up its economy. That economic line was never linear and always subject to the many compromises intrinsic to a great democracy, but it remains the key to India moving from potential to delivery. Thanks, Gordon. I may end at that point.
Well, thank you so much. One of the things that we at the Perth USAsia Centre, in fact, I think probably most in the foreign policy think tank community that we're part of, aspire to do is to move beyond just kind of breathless short takes that are most common in the media and look at longer term analysis. And there are few people in Australia that are better at taking, the current, the short term, and putting it in a broader strategic perspective than Peter. So Peter, thank you so much for that tour de force, looking at not just the bilateral relationship between Australia and India, but India itself, its trajectory, and its trajectory within this region and within global trends. I learned a lot. I've got several pages of notes and a lot of questions, but to protect our audience from me, today we're delighted to have a panel, to have a better conversation. We're joined now, and we're going to transition into a panel discussion part of it by Stephen Smith, who's a member of the board of the Perth USAsia Centre, also shares the title of Distinguished Fellow along with Peter, and is joined, as I mentioned before, Peter and I on several trips to India, and until this current year was a regular attendee at the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi as well. Stephen also serves as chairman of the board of the newly established Defence and Security Institute here at UWA, and most of our audience will know him as a former foreign minister and defense minister. In addition to Stephen, we have the newest member of our team here at the Perth USAsia Centre. Sonia Arakel is a policy fellow here in our Perth office, calling in from home today just to make sure that we're socially distanced and that we can see everyone's face rather than wearing masks, being in the same room. Sonia joins us most recently from working for Ben Wyatt, the recently resigned treasurer in the state government, but also worked for Member of Parliament Tim Watts in Melbourne, for the Nous group, has a great experience in government and in the private sector. And we're delighted to have her help us kind of think through the implications for not only Australia more broadly, but Western Australia specifically in our engagement with India. What I'm going to do is, before I launch into a couple of broader questions, we've got about 50 minutes, 55 minutes or so for a good conversation at this point. I'm going to ask our two panelists just to kind of react to some of the things they heard in Peter's remark. What struck you? What areas do you think that our audience should pay more attention to? And if there's actually something that you would like Peter to kind of go into greater detail on, we'll start with that point, and then I'll come back with some specific questions of my own for the panel as a whole. But Stephen, I realized we had some technical difficulties for the first couple of minutes, but you caught a good chunk of what Peter had to say. I'll turn to you initially for your reactions, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thanks very much, Gordon, and thanks, Peter. I think given that the content today is India, I think our first comment should be that the news that we see from India and its battle with COVID is terribly distressing, and very many of us will have friends in India who are adversely affected. So our thoughts go out to our colleagues and friends in India at a very difficult moment, and we hope that the modest contribution which Australia is making to medical supplies and the like is of some assistance. But it's terrible news from India for the last few days, and that will no doubt continue for a while longer. I think my first point is that I share very much Peter's optimism, and I've been optimistic about India for a long period of time, including all that time when I was a minister. And I think Peter's made two fundamental points, which is that India would not be the rising power that it is, and would not be of such great attraction to Australia, the United States, Japan, and other countries in the Indo-Pacific, but for two very deeply significant features. One, the strength, enduring strength and potential of its economy, and secondly, its democracy. And despite the fact that in recent times we've seen India have short-term difficulties with its economy, whether it was the implementation of GST, whether it was restrictions on a cash economy, and whether it's the current fight against COVID, the long-term trajectory remains the same, which is essentially being that sometime between 2040 and 2050, India will be the second or third largest economy in the world, so competing with China, the United States, and India for that top three positions. And so I remain confident about its economic rise, and the notion of the Indo-Pacific really started with India's economic rise. Without India, there would be no Indo-Pacific. And so the fundamental thesis of the Indo-Pacific and India's rise continues. Secondly, Peter's made the very fundamental point that, of course, the attraction for like-minded countries is India's democracy. When one goes to the United States, friends and colleagues in the United States say, well, we're the greatest democracy in the world, to which the response these days is, well, your recent history may put that into some question, but more importantly, you might regard yourself as the greatest democracy in the world, but India is the largest democracy. And so we have a country, as Peter says, 1.4 billion people, a subscriber to the rule of law, a subscriber to parliamentary democracy, and very familiar with a lot of the trappings of, we are very familiar with a lot of the trappings of Indian society as a result of sort of British colonial heritage. So those two features, enduring economic strength and enduring democratic attachment, make India absolutely essential to Australia's future, to the Indo-Pacific future, but also to how global peace and security and global economic prosperity unfold over the course of the first half of this century. So thanks, Gordon, and thanks, Peter, for your, as ever, substantial contribution.
Sonia, now over to you for the same basic question and reactions before I get into my questions.
Sure. I have three reactions and one question that I hope you'll forgive me, Gordon, for putting to Peter at the end. Peter, thank you so much for such a brilliant summation of the three different areas of the India-Australia relationship. And for me, the things that really stood out was your point that understanding India in the context of the Chinese economic rises actually limits our understanding. And that's something that we really hope to embed in our centre's work in taking a sectoral and state-based approach to how we approach India's economic rise. I've also thought your quote about the Quad was one that we'll be recycling, that we're all in the same bed but dreaming different dreams. I think there's a tendency in the think tank community to look to the Quad as evidence for Australia having backers in terms of the military side of things with tensions in China. And I think your point that it is not the case that is a given is an important one to consider when we think of the strategic tensions in the Indo-Pacific. Your point about the diasporic community, and indeed our last election where one of the key marginal seats in WA, Riverton, was won by winning over the Indian diasporic community in that area. And I find it quite interesting, and I'm keen on your thoughts on what you think of the emerging narrative about this very community in the context of repatriation flights and the Australian COVID response. Are we seeing people, our leaders, taking this community for granted, or is this a necessary step to abandon its own citizens overseas?
So actually, let me build on that and ask a question for the full panel, because this is something I thought was really important for us to discuss up front. Both Stephen and Peter rightly began with expressing our deep concern with and support for what India is going through right now. But I share Sonia's worry that we are, in our reactions, domestically driven out of fear, taking some steps which might undermine our long-term image in India in terms of the Australia-India relationship. So on the one hand, where we have the Prime Minister offering much needed, and I'm sure what will be much needed support, at the same time, a particular focus on India and shutting off flights from India and stopping repatriation flights to India risks damaging our image in India at the same time. And I'm curious, maybe we'll start with you, Peter, as to the unique challenges and risks that we face at this moment in time in our own COVID response and how that might impact our relationship with India longer term.
Well, thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Stephen and Sonia, for your comments as well. Look, a couple of points I'd make. One is that I think as a general proposition, domestic trumps foreign policy in virtually all occasions short of a direct threat to national security. So many of us might lament that, but I just think it's a reality that we have to work with. Secondly, I think Australian governments traditionally have not been particularly good in building linkages with diaspora communities in a way which reinforces our foreign policy and other interests. I mean, these are communities which are, in my view, large Australian assets, and we should be thinking about them as large Australian assets, because the other part of the diaspora community, the home countries, certainly do in the case of, say, China and India, and work accordingly. This is potentially a very delicate moment for how diaspora thinking and reactions might play into the broader bilateral relationship. I think for the most part, the diaspora community probably accepts that, one, it's Australia's call about what decisions it makes on entry and return. As long as, and this is always a very important caveat when dealing with India, as long as India is not seen to be treated differently and in a discriminatory manner to others. And it's important, I think, in our communication with the Australian community, that we are sensitive to that, and that we make sure we don't open ourselves to criticism on that point. In relation to repatriation flights, which Sonia raised, I mean, this is part of a broader issue about Australians who are abroad and want to come back to Australia, and there's about 30,000 of them. In my view, you know, we should be doing everything we can to open up the bottlenecks that the quarantine system imposes on how we deal with that repatriation issue. Because I think there's a reasonable expectation by Australian citizens that they will be able to return home. And obviously such a return has to be handled in a way that's consistent with public health. So the more we can address this quarantine pipeline issue, the better placed we'll be to accept an increased number of stranded Australians abroad, and that will help in terms of bringing Indians back to Australia. So I think the handling of this is going to be quite important, and it's more than just an announcement on suspending flights or providing equipment and assistance, very welcome equipment and assistance. It needs to be part of, I think, some deeper messaging by the Australian government to both the Australian community and to the diaspora community.
So before I go to Stephen on that, I actually want to ask you your question back to you, Sonia, just because as Peter rightly points out, it is a sensitive issue, and there are particular risks, not only in how our response is perceived, whether it's fair or not fair, by the diaspora community, and then in India itself in terms of the process. Can you tell us kind of the basis for your question and your specific concerns, your own view of the challenges we face in managing that balance?
I agree with Peter, it's a delicate issue. And for that reason, I think it's important that the narrative that forms around this is important, and the narrative that our leaders are using. And I would like to see a little less around kind of distracting from the core issues, with which, as Peter acknowledges, is quarantine pipeline issue and capacity for us to bring, do our duty to our citizens overseas and bring them home, and have less of an emphasis on the situation in India. So one of our leaders yesterday used the words epicenter of death and destruction. Now, that is not the kind of words you use to describe a partner. And what I'm seeing is a lot of the narrative coming is at cross purposes to our foreign policy, in terms of, if we want to diversify away from China, and we acknowledge the importance, economic and strategic, of India as a partner, that needs to be evident in all decisions we make. And it needs to be consistent, because people listen, leaders, decision makers, business people in India listen to that. And we saw that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic last year, when the comments were made about international students. Even the kind of level with which we are looking at the reason why a particular person went back to, left the country, those kind of justifications are irrelevant, really, if the person acted within the law and within federal government selection criteria. It feels like what's happening is a distraction from the core issues in our quarantine capacity, and that coming at the cost of the diasporic community, which we all acknowledge is crucial to building a stronger economic and strategic relationship with India.
Well, thank you. And again, I think there's no question that there will be inevitable comparisons to the words we use and the approach we took to both the United States and the United Kingdom when they were at the worst of their outbreaks, and that's coming through. Stephen, I delayed coming back to you because you're unique on our panel of having a long service in Parliament, including in Cabinet for a long period of time. I have heard in recent days some discussion about the fundamental challenge of our current national cabinet, right? And that a lot of these decisions on quarantine and stuff are being made on a national cabinet level where members of that national cabinet, the premiers, are making decisions based on very low level kind of retail politics in terms of what they want to be seen to be doing on their domestic politics on the state level. And those may not always work well with national level decision making in terms of foreign policy. Can you kind of address the fundamental challenge that we face as a country now, given those dynamics, particularly with India?
Well, a couple of domestic comments, and this is not a comment on the current state of affairs. This is a comment on life in Australia in perpetuity, which is state premiers will always act in what they perceive as their state's interest, not in the national interest, because their obligation and responsibility is to the people of their state. The Commonwealth has got national interest responsibilities and national interest obligations. My starting point is slightly different from, in a sense, Peter and Sonia's, which is this. I think the most lamentable performance of the Commonwealth of Australia in dealing with COVID since its inception in February, March of 2020 has been its failure to forensically, methodically, consistently, and with a clear program, return Australians to Australia who wanted to return. That's why we now have a backlog. And that backlog now sees a pincer movement with respect to India. And so it's what hasn't been done over the last 12 months, which creates the problem now. In previous times, we've seen Australian governments of both political persuasions make much more effort in the face of global crises to return in a reasonable way, with Australians making their own modest contribution to that back home. So yes, we have a quarantine pipeline issue, but we have a backlog which should have been addressed in the last 12 months. And in my analysis, that's the fundamental cause of the problem. In terms of the risk that India sees this as some form of special action with respect to them is, as Peter puts it, the greatest risk, provided India is taking the view that we are simply acting in a way in which any country would to protect our citizens. We're doing that temporarily with respect to India, and we've taken previous conduct in the past, then this won't potentially turn from a 3-week refusal to allow transportation to a longer term problem. But we do need to be careful. In the past, many of our actions have been misinterpreted by India, and that's caused difficulties irritants in the relationship as we've gone. On the basis of what I've seen from the diaspora to date, it seems to me that the diaspora, from public expressions of leadership of the diaspora and the vox pops that you see, is understanding of the difficulties that Australia faces, but also deeply, obviously, emotionally sympathetic to what's occurring in India. So, so far, so good. But the key thing will be to make sure that both India and the diaspora understand precisely the reasons for the temporary suspension of flights to India. They are pretty obvious. But if I wanted to, in difficult circumstances, associate the cause to all of that, it's, in my view, the lack of consistent, thought through strategic action by the Commonwealth over a long period of time in its failure to return Australians, not just from India, but from all continents.
Well, thank you. In an effort to steer this conversation in a way that is more additive or constructive in intergovernment, I'd next like to turn to what should Australia be doing specifically to try to emerge from what is currently been a clear interruption to the vision that was laid out in the Australia-India economic strategy, right? That we've had a pause at a minimum because of COVID. That's limited immigration, it's limited students, it's limited in a lot of the investment travel, it's limited a lot of the people-to-people things that Peter rightly pointed out as being the basis of a lot of this. What would you recommend that Australia be doing now in preparation for the end of this COVID era to help us kind of get back on track, so to speak? So Peter, can we go back to you on that one?
Sure, Gordon. So the pause, I think, is directly linked to the closure of borders. And so if we want to move beyond the pause, we need to find ways to open our borders as quickly as possible, consistent with protecting public health. And I think there is more that we can do in that regard. The slowing down of the vaccination program obviously also pushes out the timelines for when borders can reopen. But we should be looking now, for example, to find a way to bring international students back into Australia and not compromise our public health in the process. So I think the various proposals that have been made by universities to manage a quarantine arrangement that would enable us to do that have essentially fallen victim to excessive caution on the part, particularly of state governments, at the optics of being seen to allow international students back when stranded Australians are struggling. And I'm not urging international students be given preference to stranded Australians. Obviously, Australian citizens should be our first preference, but finding ways to open our borders, if not fully, then at least selectively, I think is very important. In the meantime, of course, there are many things that can and are being done to keep this relationship moving forward. I mean, obviously, geopolitically, the relationship is moving very quickly, much more quickly than I would have anticipated, but I think there's probably a China border behavior reason for some of that. I think seeing whether we can revive the free trade agreement negotiations, which doesn't require the opening of borders to continue those negotiations, are important, as long as we have a realistic understanding of what our prospects are, and as long as we don't convince ourselves that the future of the economic relationship depends on securing a free trade agreement, because I don't think it does. I mean, I think nothing in my report and the recommendations I made were contingent on concluding a free trade agreement. And, you know, I think also I would like to see us move more substantively to engage the Indian system in a policy dialogue on these bigger questions of economic reform, public sector reform, public administration reform, because these are all fundamental to India's long-term future. And while there are obviously large differences between the Australian experience and the Indian experience, I think there are also things we have done which could be of interest and value to India as it looks at its own sort of reforms. I mean, bear in mind, Australia has travelled this journey from a highly protectionist to a very open economy. And we've also travelled on a journey of reforms to our public sector, which I think is a very large priority for India. The weakness of state capacity, I think, is probably, you know, amongst the top 2 or 3 challenges facing India. So I think there are a number of things we can do, but I would like to see us do more to address that border question. And then it gets back to what we've been talking about in terms of quarantine and so on.
Fantastic. Well, situated as we are here at the University of Western Australia, you know, your focus on students is obviously going to be very welcome here. I note your role as Chancellor of the University of Queensland. I'm sure it would be welcome there in Brisbane as well. I would steer our viewers towards an interview we did just the week before last with Vicky Thompson, who's the CEO of the Group of 8 universities. And I know that in our university sector, there's been an awful lot of thinking done about the processes necessary to reestablish that essential kind of lifeline there. Stephen, let's go to you. Any other specific things that you'd like to focus on?
Well, to take, in a sense, Peter's lead, I think we should look slightly to the longer term as to the things that we can do. There will continue to be COVID disruptions, and not just the economic relationship between Australia and India. So I think with India, it's important that we take a bit of a longer term view. India, Peter mentioned earlier that India should be in APEC. Yes, of course it should. We should be making that clear and working towards that. We should also be at the pointy end of the spear in making the point that it's important that India enters into RCEP. And so we should be trying to build the pathway for India entering into RCEP. We now have the perversity that the United States is not in the TPP and India is not in RCEP. So there are longer term things we can do. I absolutely agree with Peter that we need to be careful to not adopt a cargo cult mentality for a free trade agreement with India. The pathway for enhanced economic engagement is already there, not just with Peter's report, but with Anil Wadhwa's response. I've been disappointed that the Australian government didn't lead on Wadhwa's report with proposals for joint implementation of the two reports, but there are plenty of pathways and guidance there for business. And I think in the current environment, which will continue, and in terms of China's conduct, in my instinct, get worse before it gets better. Currently, it's the strategic which is driving the economic. So that strategic setting won't change. And so there will be an enthusiasm on the part of India to not just engage strategically, but also to engage economically. So I think the pathway to the future is, albeit the terrible circumstance at the moment, I think is quite promising. There'll also be some economic activity which is linked to the strategic. And so there are real opportunities for Australia and India, together with Japan and the United States, on the critical minerals or rare earth front. So if we take a longer term view and not just how can we manage to make the disruption of COVID less worse than it is, then I think ultimately we'll be successful with our economic engagement with India. India has changed its attitude qualitatively in the last period, and that means that we should be thinking of every possible engagement that we can to make the economic engagement catch up with the strategic and the security.
Fantastic. Sonia, I know that you're working on a broader effort to kind of look at India beyond just Delhi. What would you add to the comments of Peter and Stephen?
I would echo Peter's opening point about an investment-first approach. I think that is a clear imperative on the economic relationship as we wait for trade agreements and multilateral and trilateral forums to develop. And government doesn't lead that, but they have a role in helping Australian business understand the reform that has happened over the last few years, and at the same time encouraging further reform on India's part. Stephen mentioned, that the strategic is leading the economic, and I think that's true. And there's a lot that Wadhwa called out in his report that Australia can do in the meantime while we wait for our economies to open up again. That looks like things like addressing taxation concerns of Indian companies, easing regulations of banks, of Indian banks operating in Australia, and streamlining visa processes. Those are some low-hanging fruit that are quick wins that we can work on regardless of whether we have people traveling between the two countries. And finally, Peter also made this point that it's a crowded marketplace in India, and Indian businesses, politicians, communities, they don't turn naturally to Australia, but instead often go to the US, Japan, and Europe. So now is the time to think about how do we, do the equivalent of a Good Day USA program, but in India, so that we become the natural partner to turn to, whether it's critical minerals or agricultural exports.
Well, thank you. I like that specific idea. Time zones make that a little bit easier with India as well. I appreciate that. Before we move on to other topics, we did have one question that came in beforehand from Mr. Harsh Grover, who's a director of Grover Project. And he wanted to know essentially that given how COVID has kind of reset the education links between Australia and India, what the panel's anticipation is about the future. Do we think that this will just be a year-long kind of interruption and then we'll quickly be back to the same numbers that we had pre-COVID? Or is this a fundamental shift in a paradigm? Peter, what's your best guess on that front?
So I don't think it's likely to be a fundamental shift in the paradigm. I think the broad shape of the education relationship and the opportunities that it represents for both sides will survive the COVID period, although the COVID period has obviously had a serious short-term impact. You know, one of the points I tried to make in my report was that we needed to work on shifting the profile of the education relationship so that when Indian students think about coming to Australia, they are also thinking about the quality of an Australian education. For the most part, the Indian student numbers in Australia are driven by a migration objective, not an education objective. There's nothing kind of wrong with that for as long as Australia remains a country of high migration, which I hope will be for a very long time. But we need to sort of reposition Australia as a country which offers a world-class education so that that cohort of Indians that want to study abroad for a quality education, which is a very significant cohort getting bigger and will grow as incomes in India grow, don't always think about the US and the UK as the sort of places to go for quality. And that means a much bigger emphasis on joint research, collaboration, postgraduate linkages, the sorts of things that many Australian universities, including my own, are now doing in India. I think where we haven't made much progress at all, regrettably, is on the vocational education side. I mean, it's a no-brainer when you look at the demand for vocational skills in India and Australia's sort of capacity as a provider of vocational education, that the two should come together much more easily and in greater dimensions than they are now. So, you know, I think we need to do a lot more work on our business models for vocational education with India. But, you know, overall, it remains my view that education will be the flagship of this relationship in terms of our sectoral connections. And that is just a sort of a reflection, I think, of supply and demand. I mean, the education deficit in India is so big that the demand for an Australian education, I think, will always remain high. And once we get through the COVID period, I expect that dynamic to sort of, kick back in. And then, the last thing I'd say about the education relationship is that we need to be a bit more imaginative about working in partnership with India on the design of curriculum, because India's education deficit, 400 million people wanting to be upskilled, will only be achieved bridging that deficit off the back of online platforms. And India needs no assistance from anyone in terms of the design of those platforms and the reach of the platforms. But where I think Australia can play a role is on designing content, working with India on designing content, because I think we can do that reasonably well. So there are the sort of areas of opportunity in my view, and I don't think any of those have been fundamentally shifted by COVID. Delayed certainly, but not shifted.
So if I can just sum up several of the comments that you've just made, Peter, which I think are useful for our audience to understand, is that, given our relatively small size as a country, at least in population, there's a limit to, the actual amount of investment dollars we have to put in India, the size of our overall education system, our productive capabilities and experts. I mean, we're limited in terms of size. And yet the real influence we might have might be in what you were talking about, a design of the education system and the content. And as you're saying earlier on, engaging India in a systemic policy dialogue about the economic reforms. And here's an area where Australia is probably less controversial than, say, maybe the United States might be, or the UK might be, or the EU might be. Our ability to come in based on our own lived experience and share those experience that or knowledge in a policy dialogue, whether it's an education or economic reform, I think is an opportunity that we ought to be seeking to more actively exploit.
Gordon, if I could just make one point there, I definitely agree with that, but I wouldn't dismiss completely our size, because the one thing that's fundamentally changed in this relationship is that India now takes Australia seriously in our own right. And part of that is a recognition that on both the economic and the strategic side, we do have something to contribute. And while Australia historically has seen itself as sort of a small to medium sized power, I mean, we do rank in the top, 12, 13, 14 in the world in terms of the size of our economy and the capacity of our defense forces. So the question of size is not irrelevant to the way Indians think about Australia, and that's what's really changed about Indian perceptions of Australia.
No, and we're going to get to the Quad in a minute, because it is striking that we are a member of the Quad. When you have Japan with over 100 million people, and India with 1 billion, and the US with 350 million, there is a strong indication precisely what you're talking about there. But before we go to the Quad, Stephen, if I can go back to you, we've got several questions that deal with India's role in Southeast Asia, in our region. And I know this is something you've thought about and spoken about frequently. Mr. Roystal asked, how would we see Indonesia's role in the region, given the fact that they're predominantly Muslim, while India is prominently Hindu? Would this be an issue? Could you kind of talk about India's role in Southeast Asia, and then particularly the role of the relationship between India and Indonesia, and whatever role that Australia might play in that?
Well, just on education, I agree with everything that Peter had to say. And I think it is important that when we go back to the Australia-India education relationship, that we understand in Australia that it has to be more than just students. It's got to be joint work and action between universities. It has to be research-based and the like. So I agree with Peter. This is a deferral and delay, not a defeat. But we have to change our mindset that it's not just all about Australia getting students. On India and ASEAN, I don't think that the ethnic or religious differences are going to get in the way of anything. First point. Secondly, India, of course, is a dialogue partner of ASEAN, and as a consequence is a member of the East Asia Summit. And to me, that remains the most important piece of the regional architecture, because all of the key players are there: Indonesia, Singapore and ASEAN, US, Australia, China, Japan, India, Korea. So its engagement with Southeast Asia has long been part of its initially look east and then act east policy. In terms of India and Indonesia, I see very significant opportunities there for Australia seeking to forge a trilateral. In a multipolar world, the minilaterals become important. We do a Australia, US, Japan trilateral. I've long been keen on substantially enhancing an India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral. So I do see a lot of potential in the India, Indonesia and India ASEAN relationship. Certainly the adoption by India and ASEAN of Indo-Pacific strategies or outlooks or approaches helps and assists that. But what we do want to see is not just Australia's engagement on the Indo side of the Indo-Pacific, but also India's engagement with ASEAN, and I'm confident about that. I know you'll go to a conversation about the Quad, but in terms of Australia's size, just echo Peter's point, on any given day, we are not just a member of the G20, we are comfortably within the top 15 world economies, and we are comfortably within the top 15 countries in terms of military defence and peacekeeping spend and contribution. So we're a significant global player, and we should conduct ourselves accordingly.
So before we go on to the Quad, and let's stick with ASEAN a little bit. Our former colleague Nat Sambi was asking the question fundamentally about what ASEAN centrality looks like in this current era. And so, Peter, let me go back to you just to take advantage of having you here. There have always been tensions between, and Stephen frequently identifies this, between ASEAN unanimity and ASEAN centrality. And so their effectiveness as an organization is in some respects inhibited by the focus on unanimity. And yet, we were looking at India's relationship with the region. I want to bring you in on a very specific topic, which we haven't touched yet, and that's obviously the ongoing crisis in Myanmar. That seems to be one of these issues where, given that it straddles South Asia and Southeast Asia, it seems to be one of those issues that could have real spillover effect on the relationship and the role of India in Southeast Asia and on ASEAN centrality / ASEAN unanimity itself. So again, I realize it's a big question, but any thoughts that you have on how that plays out in the relationships we've been discussing?
So Gordon, before getting to Myanmar, on the broader India-Southeast Asia relationship, I think we will see India investing much more diplomatic and economic effort into Southeast Asia. I mean, for India, Southeast Asia is contiguous. I mean, they share a border with Myanmar. The historical connections are very deep, and I suspect India will try and play to those historical connections as they build a stronger Southeast Asia strategy. And the economic pull of the ASEAN market, I think, will also influence India's position, as will India's views of where Southeast Asia fits vis-a-vis China. So for all of those reasons, I think we will see a bigger push by India into Southeast Asia. And I share Stephen's view about Indonesia, India, and Australia and the merits of a trilateral. I mean, I'm always struck by just how similar Indonesia and India are in so many aspects of their outlook on the world, their worldview, their attachment to strategic autonomy, their instinct for non-alignment. The similarity goes also through to many of their domestic challenges, but that's another story. On Myanmar, look, I think the reality with Myanmar is that external influence on Myanmar is depressingly limited if we're looking for a way out of the awful situation there. But to the extent there is any party that can exert an influence, it will be first ASEAN and then countries like India, which have a close relationship with Myanmar, which India's fairly cautious in its public positioning on Myanmar. I mean, notwithstanding its own democratic credentials and notwithstanding, I think, its genuine concern at the action that the military has taken, I think India is keen to maintain a line of communication through to the military leadership. So if we are to see a resolution of what's happening in Myanmar, I suspect a group that would have ASEAN at its core, but which would include, I think, a role for India is quite likely. ASEAN, centrality is a much overhyped concept, but I think in the case of Myanmar, it's probably accurate to the extent anyone is going to be central to trying sorting this out. It will be ASEAN.
Oh, thank you. Let's move on to the Quad. For the bulk of my professional career, when you were talking about regionalism in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, there was a broad presumption that economic regionalism was much easier, and it would lay the foundation for any type of security cooperation. And so it's kind of striking that if you look at the Quad right now, that in some respects, there is an easier dialogue, at least on that level, on security issues than there is on economic issues. As Stephen frequently notes, you've got RCEP that doesn't have India, that does have the US. You have the TPP, which doesn't have the US in terms of that process. And so you've got these kind of mixed things in the process, yet the security dialogue seems a little bit more vibrant. Both Stephen and Peter will probably join me in my pleasant surprise at the March 13th Quad Leaders Virtual Dialogue with Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, Prime Minister Suga, and President Biden. Not just that it happened, and it happened so soon after a US presidential election, but they came up with a joint statement. And again, my presumption is both of you bear some scars from trying to negotiate joint statements and how difficult that might be. But not only did they come out with a kind of a joint document from the conversation, but they had a joint op-ed in the Washington Post that some have commented is quite remarkable in that it's not just 4 countries, but at least 3 very different civilizations coming together in similar wording, similar vision. So I'm curious as to how you view not just the Quad, what's happened thus far, but where you think that's likely to go. I know you addressed that a little bit in your remarks, Peter, but we'll start with you, and then I'm going to go to Sonia, and then back to Stephen, if I could.
So, Gordon, I think the Quad is now much more significant than it's been at any previous time, and obviously raising the meeting to a leadership level was an important step, both a substantive step and a symbolic step. But there is still, in my view, a rather large gap between the Quad as a grouping and the Quad as an instrument that is capable of exercising collective leverage vis-a-vis China. And to me, the fundamental purpose of the Quad should be precisely that, the collective exercise of leverage in relation to China on issues where China's behavior is unacceptable and beyond the pale. Personally, I'm less attracted to this emerging idea that you should pile onto the Quad a whole list of other objectives, such as climate change and pandemics and infrastructure. I think there are better ways to address those issues than to put them at the center of the Quad. So I would hope that as we build up the Quad, we don't lose sight of why we are doing this, and we don't try and make the Quad the answer to every issue that's running through the region. Now, in order for the Quad to get to the point where it has both the capacity and the political will to exercise leverage, a lot more needs to be done. So I think we're at the early declaratory stages of the Quad. I think if we want to put substance on it, we're better off with a very sharp focus on instruments of leverage rather than getting together to do all the other things that regional institutions, will have on their agenda.
So let me push back on that a little bit, in that this Quad leaders meeting was remarkable in that many people anticipated that it would come out with a joint statement on China. And instead they came out with a focus on, pandemic response, vaccine production, distribution, on climate change, and on technology, right? And so in some respects, I can see how that detracts from what you're talking about, the collective, leveraging of their influence in response to China. But it also seems to me that more forward-looking additive narrative was essential to bring not just India, but Australia on board politically, right? And so in other words, if it was framed entirely as an exercise of leverage on China, it would be politically difficult for either Australia or India to be so full-throated in their embrace of the Quad. Is that not kind of a dynamic in terms of our own domestic politics, both in India and Australia, in terms of willingness to come on board?
Yeah, no, I think you're right up to a point, although what the traffic would bear today in relation to signalling to China, I think is much more than would have been the case in the past, and particularly with India. You know, at the end of the day, the structural flaw in the Quad is going to be the fact that 3 of them are allies and the 4th isn't. At the moment, there's enough common ground for that not to matter. And China's behavior on the border has created even more common ground. At some point, I suspect the Quad will get into issues where that fault line actually does become an issue. But that's, you know, that's down the track.
Sonia, you among the things you reacted to in Peter's initial remarks was precisely this tension within the Quad. I'm curious as to your reaction to where the conversation has gone thus far.
I would draw the fault line slightly differently to Peter, but I agree that it exists. And I think it's evident from the leaders' meeting that the reluctance to have a consensus around how to leverage the Quad in terms of tensions with China and the focus on non-defense and strategic issues indicates to me that that consensus wasn't reached. And that's worrying to me that it wasn't explicitly called out and that they struggled to come to a joint statement on those issues. But as Peter acknowledges, comes as no surprise. And the fault line, the way I see it, is the level to which the Australian and Japanese economies are integrated into China's. India has had armed conflict with China in recent years. The US is explicit about the role it would play in the defense of Taiwan. And I think India and the US have a very different appetite to use the Quad on strategic issues compared to countries like Japan and Australia that are still trying to understand how to balance its economic interests with its defense.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree more. And again, I think Peter is exactly correct in that the relationship, particularly given the last year of economic coercion against Australia by China, by the border disputes that you point to in India, there probably is a capability of the Quad to kind of bear a more direct focus on China. But in the broader game of diplomacy, I found most analysts kind of applauding the fact that the Quad had a forward-looking agenda that wasn't just anti-China, right? The fact that they were doing other things together. And my guess is that probably applies to Southeast Asia as well, how other countries in the region viewed the Quad, not just as a negative, but as a positive influence. Stephen, you've given a lot of thought to this in recent years.
Yeah, well, I think we need to try and be clear-sighted about this. So a couple of sort of fundamental points. Firstly, the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. So one of the risks of the Quad is that everyone assumes that that is all there is to the Indo-Pacific. And of course it's not, because if it was a quint, i.e. if the Quad was 5 and included Indonesia, then it would be much more the Indo-Pacific. So I think we need to be very careful not to assume that the Quad represents all that there is in the Indo-Pacific. And I think in what has changed and what has turned the Quad to a leader level meeting now with forward-looking issues being addressed has been changed strategic circumstances. I mean, the first incarnation of the Quad failed for lack of enthusiasm by Japan, by India, the United States and Australia in the context of China being, as we used to say until 2013, 2014, a responsible stakeholder, to use Bob Zellick's expression, or the Deng Xiaoping consensus. In other words, what has changed, which has seen Quad revitalised and now putting itself in a position where you not only have a joint communique, but a joint op-ed in the Washington Post, is changed circumstances in China. So what is the Quad about? The Quad is about how can like-minded countries have a conversation about balancing an assertive and aggressive China. That's the reality, and we shouldn't be blind to that. If China had not changed from 2013-14 on to an aggressive, assertive China, and as Peter put it in his remarks, a country, because of its aggression and assertiveness and failure to live by the rules of the road, increasingly losing respect from a range of countries, then Quad Mark II would not be there. Final point, I think Peter's got a good point, which is let's not throw everything onto the Quad, and that goes back to my first point, which is the Quad is not the Indo-Pacific. Whilst there'll be difficulties in this route, I would much prefer to be throwing things onto the East Asia Summit, because there you have everyone in the room at the same time at foreign, defence and leaders level, effectively on an annual basis. So the Quad is there because of a changed China circumstance. And just as Australia is now looking at the diversification of its export markets and export commodities, and the single most important contribution to that was made by the Chinese ambassador to Australia when he threatened 10 or so commodities with economic coercion and economic punishment. The single biggest factor in the revitalisation of the Quad has been China's activity on the Indian border. So we shouldn't be blind to the reasons why the Quad has re-emerged into a substantially more important context. Finally, on Sonia's point, it is the case that Australia's economic relationship with China is inextricably interwoven, as is Japan's, as is just about 200 other countries throughout the globe, including India and including the United States. So in the last ideological or large power contest between the US and the Soviet Union, there was next to no economic implications of that. It was an ideological battle. But I describe our current circumstances as small c, small w, Cold War with economic characteristics, because pretty well everyone of any note in our part of the world has China as its largest trading partner, and on more occasions than not, a perception that it is a particular country's most important economic partner. In Australia's case, that's not right, because overall our most important economic partner is the United States when you take investment into account. But part of the difficulty we're going through, and it's not just reticence, perceived or real on the part of Japan or Australia, is that pretty well everyone's got an intense economic relationship with China. And how do we balance that under changed strategic circumstances?
Look, I haven't even made a dent in the long list of questions that we have, or my own questions, and we could have gone on for a lot longer, but we're at the end of the meeting here. I would anticipate that probably every newspaper in Australia today, most TV and radio stations are going to be focused on the immediate today situation on the ground in Delhi. And again, our hearts go out to the Indian people during their time of need, and we're heartened to see a robust Australian response in help to that. But we're fortunate to have a wonderful keynote address by Peter Varghese helping us put the current events in a much broader strategic context. And I think it's only when you look longer term that you get that fundamental sense of optimism. So my particular thanks to Peter for giving us the time and his reviews today. We're sorry that we don't have you here in person with a full audience. We have you in person in the office, but not with our community here. We'll have you back again soon. Thank you to Stephen and Sonia for sharing your insights and joining in this conversation. And on behalf of the Perth USAsia Centre, we thank all of you for taking your time to kind of look broadly at the important relationship between Australia and India and the role that India will play in this Indo-Pacific era. So thank you. Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gordon. Thank you all.